Hi everyone, today we're gonna set up the February bullet journal layout together, and as you can see we have a pretty decoration heavy Year of the Dragon inspired theme to go through. Dragon is the Chinese zodiac sign for this year, and I thought it was a great opportunity to create something a bit different. And we are gonna start from the cover spread as usual, which might look a bit intimidating, but we'll go through all of this step by step. I know I just used navy blue paper in my previous January theme, and I usually kind of like to change it up, but I just had this vision for the color palette for this specific spread that required a darker color for the background. I know that like 5 out of 6 of my previous monthly themes have had some dark paper backgrounds, but I think we'll have some lighter themes coming up in the spring and summer, so please bear with me while I'm going through this phase. Anyway, I started by creating this window thing in the middle that I actually ended up removing in the very end. You'll see, but we're still gonna use it on another spread, so I still wanted to show you all the steps. We're starting by cutting this rounded shape out of the middle using a paper knife and this cutting palette, which is from Paper World. I don't know if you guys remember, but I always used to use the back cardboard of my watercolor paper palette for this purpose, but this real cutting board definitely feels sturdier and easier to move around. Anyway, then I wanted a dark color for this frame, but something other than blue, so I went with this brownish dark red shade. I mixed a few different gouache paints to achieve this color, which was actually pretty close to my nail polish shade, and then I just painted this window from both sides. I used a paper underneath because this is definitely a messy step, and it also took a while to let both of the sides dry completely. But after they did, we can start to draw these corner decorations with light yellow paint. However, doing this with a brush felt really flimsy, so I quickly switched to one of these acrylic paint pens I have, which worked much better to create straight lines. I still had to go over these lines a few times because my pen wasn't pigmented enough, but eventually this worked much better than the gouache paint, and then I just repeated the same pattern to all the corners. I also created a light frame along the window opening, which also required a few color attempts, but I like how it eventually turned out. But then we can get to the fun part, which is drawing the dragon. So I sacrificed a page for this from the back of my journal because I wanted to draw the dragon against a white background and also test this watercolor paper with real painting a little bit more. So this is the Mellow Days watercolor bullet journal, and I wanted to test the actual notebook paper a little bit more. This white color will also make seeing this sketch and line work a lot easier than doing it straight on the blue paper, and we can use watercolors for the coloring part, which made the coloring process much faster than having to use gouache paints against the background. Anyway, I speeded through most of the pencil sketching because it took me a while, but basically I just started by drawing this S shape for the body and slowly progressed to define the outlines, the head shape, and even the legs and mane of the dragon. This part requires a lot of erasing and redrawing, so if you feel like you have to do that a lot to your own drawings, just know that it's a completely normal part of the process. But then we're gonna draw the whole thing again with black Pigma Micron pens. I used a little bit thicker pen for the main outlines and then a thinner pen for all the texture and smaller lines that we're gonna draw after the main shape is done. Drawing this dragon was so much fun. I feel like there's such freedom in drawing fantasy creatures because there are no rules or strict guidelines. Your dragon can pretty much look exactly like you want it to look like. And I went with this kind of snake-like dragon that's a little bit easier to draw maybe. You just need a long body, and I gave some legs to my dragon as well. I actually drew something quite similar in August, I think 2.5 years ago, and it was really interesting to see the improvement and especially the confidence I've gained with drawing in general. I remember back then trying to draw legs for my dragon but failing miserably, which is why the old one has no legs. It also doesn't have much texture in the body or anything like that. So even though the end result is maybe not that different, it was still interesting to see the improvement in the drawing process itself. I really encourage you to revisit some of your old drawings every once in a while too, because it really shows how your style and confidence are improving. But anyway, the line work is quite self-explanatory. I created a lot of scales and fine lines to the mane, which took some time but also gave the final drawing a much more polished look. And then we are ready to jump to the coloring part. As I mentioned, we'll do the coloring with watercolors, which just seemed like the easiest solution with the ink line work. Using gouache paints would cover the outlines, so if you want to do that, you just need to color first and draw any possible outlines later. I wanted to mix some blue, red and orange tones in this dragon, so I painted the body itself with this grayish blue color and then the mane with red and orange. I was able to do some shadowing here, which shows that this Mellow Days watercolor bullet journal paper is definitely better suited for painting than regular bullet journals, but I still wouldn't exactly compare it to real watercolor paper. I found that the colors still dried pretty fast and didn't blend together as seamlessly as I'm used to, but I think it's still a great in-between, which also works for regular writing and drawing. Anyway, I tried to add a darker red shade closer to the body and then add a little bit more orange to the tips of the hairs, which didn't exactly work, but it was still okay. And in the end, we have the dragon ready to go. The next step was to cut this along the outlines, and I decided to leave a small white margin, mainly because it would have been too tedious to try to follow the outlines perfectly. This separate tail part goes to the left page, and at this point I wasn't exactly sure how I felt about the colors and the window thing here, but I decided to just keep going to see what happens. I still wanted to add some more simple decorations to the background, so we'll start by painting some of these lanterns and other hanging elements. I used gouache paints for this step and mixed some new paints and water with the old ones that had already dried on my painting palette. I tried to keep the red tone a little bit lighter and closer to orange maybe in these ones, and I also drew some of the finer details with the same paint pens that we used earlier. I also did some line patterns to the bottom edge of the page and drew some white cloud swirls to the background to kind of fill up the space even more. Honestly, I'm again not so happy with how this all turned out. This was one of those pages where I liked all the decorations separately, but just seeing these colors and everything together didn't really do it for me. I realized that I don't really like red and blue together. I'm not really a primary color person. But you know, sometimes you just have to try something different, and if it doesn't work, it doesn't matter. I think maybe using black or dark gray paper in the background would have worked better and neutralized the color palette a little bit. If I had the time and energy, I would have probably changed the background color and just painted the decorations on top again and reattached the dragon and calendar to it. But I think it's a much more important lesson to sometimes let things go and try again next time. I know many of us struggle with perfectionism, especially when starting bullet journaling, and learning to let things go has been something that has made this hobby so much more enjoyable for me throughout the years. I also completely forgot to film the part where I wrote the February title, but I hope you can still kind of figure out how I did it. Anyway, after the calendar and all were in place, I ended up removing the window thing as I mentioned earlier. I just didn't see any purpose for it and thought it was a bit too much here, so I cut it out with the same paper knife, and then we can finally move on in the setup. Next, we're setting up a combination spread for the monthly planning and the monthly reflection. I really like to use these combination spreads because it usually allows at least some shared decorations. So here I cut out the top and bottom of this middle page and then started to draw this half circle pattern to those areas. I'm using this gray blue pen that I think matches pretty well with the navy color we used earlier, while being a little bit less saturated. And I had sketched the pattern out slightly beforehand, but you can maybe see that my circles are not exactly the same size, but I feel like it doesn't really matter. Often a busier pattern like this kind of evens itself out when it's all done, at least if you don't look too closely. I absolutely love using repeating patterns in my bullet journal. First of all, they often create very nice decorations, but they're also surprisingly easy and carefree to create. I think this is something you can definitely achieve even if you have never practiced drawing so much. So that's also why I love including stuff like this in the videos. But anyway, I left the top left and right bottom corners empty for now because we're adding some other decorations there, and we'll start from the top corner. So I wanted to paint a few more hanging red lanterns. I did these in a slightly different style. So I still used the same gouache paints that I had in my painting palette and tried to keep the color lighter towards the top middle of the lantern and then add a slightly darker tone towards the edges and the bottom. I think this just created subtle dimensions to the shape, and then using some light and dark pens again, I added some final details to the lanterns like some messy flower shapes and then these black details. But after that, we can move on to set this planning spread itself. So this is a page that I'll fill at the beginning of the month to create some sort of overview plan for the month ahead and really take a look at everything that's going on in my life. I started with this cursive title, and I thought this pretty decorative, elegant font suited the rest of the decorations. By the way, I always sketch out my titles beforehand with a pencil because I never get them in the middle otherwise, and it just takes so much pressure away. After that, I wanted to list 3 things I'll promise myself to do in February. I haven't really worded it like this in the past, but I thought this might add an extra bit of accountability. I've had some struggles to keep up a consistent schedule recently, and the biggest cause for that is that we got a new family member in mid-January. So this is Luna. She's now about a 5 months old ragdoll, and I fully enjoyed spending time with her. She's such a social and playful baby and loves to snuggle and just be with us. So I've had to adjust to this new life where I don't want to leave my couch because there's an adorable furball laying on me or next to me. Okay, maybe I'm over exaggerating a little bit, but it's been really nice to relax and have some life outside of work recently. So my goal in February is really to try to create a routine where I waste as little time as possible to get my work done for the day and then have my free time. For me, that's definitely easier said than done. Work-life balance is something I definitely struggle with a lot, but having a bullet journal is one of those things that I know are helping me to get there. So yeah, the rest of the spread is pretty self-explanatory. I painted this box frame with the same gouache paints, and then I have some room to write about my shop's spring launch, which is coming around mid-March, so a bit later than usual, but there will be some exciting new products as well. And then lastly, I added a few habit trackers because one of the things I want to do is get into the habit of checking and keeping up with my bullet journal more often. I haven't been very good at that recently, I'm not gonna lie, which always happens when my work motivation is lower than usual. But that's all for the planning side, and then let's flip over to the reflection page where we'll start with a title again. So unlike the previous spread, this one I'll fill at the very end of February to look back and reflect on everything that happened and how I was able to keep up with my own plans and promises. So after the title, I started to paint these two boxes just to add some simple decorations and color to these pages. It was a little bit difficult to keep the lines even, so I had to go over some of the edges with a white pen to cover some of the mistakes. And then I used some other colored pens to add swirls to the corners and some lines to the sides of the boxes. I'll use these to write about what's on my mind and what I'm grateful for, which are both questions I include on the reflection page pretty much every month. The first one just lets me get whatever is on my mind at the moment onto the page in a very brain dump type way. And then I think gratitude and reminding yourself of all the good things in your life is just so important in general and helps you to not take stuff for granted. Then on the second page, I decided to write these extra questions about the monthly goals and if I managed to keep up with a better routine like I wanted. So I'm really leaning on to this consistency thing in February and trying to add these extra things to keep myself accountable and be reminded of those goals. So at the end of the month, I'll need to answer yes or no to these questions and provide some reasons for the answer. And then before we move on to the last section of this monthly theme, I wanted to throw another dragon illustration here in the free corner. I made this one a little bit bigger and focused mainly on the head of the dragon. I'd say that the style and steps are pretty similar to what we did earlier. So I started with a pencil sketch and after defining the outlines and initial shape to the point I was happy with, I started to go over the main lines with black pens to intensify the final image. After that, we can take out some paints again. I decided to change the color slightly and make this dragon a little bit more simple and quick compared to the first one. So I just added a pretty solid wash of color everywhere, not really focusing much on shadowing or anything extra. So I just added this flame red color to the mane and a dark gray-black color to the body. The red color is actually from the gouache paints. I just mixed a lot of water with the paint to not cover all the outlines. And then I use the same watercolors for all the other colors here. But that's finally all for these planning and reflection pages, and now let's flip over to set up the weekly section for February. So as I mentioned, I really wanted to use the red page we did on the cover spread, since I already used time and effort to create it and it felt like such a waste otherwise, and I thought with some compromises we could use it to outline the weekly area. So I started by cutting these next two pages following the same round shape we did on the cutout part, and then to make things a little bit more interesting, I decided to draw the same half circle pattern to decorate the middle of the red page. I don't know if this was the prettiest decoration option, but I think it suits the theme pretty well and also allowed a fun shape for the weekly Dutch door pages in the middle. So after doing this back page, I wanted to repeat the same design to the other side by just directly painting it to the page. I was trying to be so careful here with the red paint because somehow I always get it to the other side, so I worked very slowly and tried not to use too much water to prevent the page from buckling as much as possible or the paint from bleeding through. After the red paint had dried, I drew the same corner pattern here and also outlined the middle, which helped to create a very similar look to the other page. If I hadn't done this for another spread first, I would have probably made a different shape here that would have followed the shape of these middle pages exactly. I think it now looks a little bit awkward how the inner sides of the red shape kind of disrupts the flow here, but I thought it was still better than not using this frame for anything, and it's something that I can definitely live with. Anyway, then the last thing is to write out the weekly pages themselves, and I'll just use the most basic layout possible here. All I did was color these boxes for the weekdays and leave some space under them to write a short to-do list. This is also something I'll try to do better in February. I want to have like 2 to 4 work-related tasks for each day here that I'll need to get done before going to sleep. But anyway, I'll use the same layout for the other weeks and didn't write the numbers yet because I'm not sure if I need to start this first week from the 5th or from the 29th of January. So I'll figure that out later. Anyway, that finally finished this February Year of the Dragon inspired theme. It's not my own personal favorite, but I still really enjoyed drawing the dragons especially, and I hope you enjoyed following along. Also, one thing I mentioned probably my yearly flip through video is that I wanted to add some stickers or washi tapes to the themes after everything is done, but I just haven't had any products that really suited this or the previous theme, so that's why I didn't do that, but I think we can probably do it for some of the upcoming spring and summer themes. Anyway, if this was your first time around here and you'd like to stay tuned for more art and journaling, please consider subscribing. But I think that's all for this time. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you're having an amazing day or night wherever you are, and see you in my next one. Bye bye!